Hi, welcome back for another episode of PianoTales Podcast. I'm your host, Amelia Fong. I'm really excited for today's guest. His name is Kai Ono. He came up with a really interesting book idea. I'm really excited for him to talk about his experiences writing this book, engaging the creativity in it in order to engage his students, as well as his background and journey with piano. So let's give it up for Kai Ono.
I've been pretty much steadily teaching all the way since high school. As I've gained experience, I've also been writing a lot of pieces for my students, which recently then turned into the two books that you just mentioned, For the Birds and For the Little Birds, that I recently had published with a friend of mine who owns a publishing company called My Melodies.
But I'm just curious, what prompted you to write the book, specifically for the Little Birds, the beginner one?
So I've been writing these books now. I've been writing the pieces now for a very long time, actually. I think some of the earliest pieces for the Little Birds, especially, go back to when I was a freshman or sophomore in college. Basically, what ends up happening is I'm teaching the students and I want to give them a certain kind of piece and I can't find it. So I started just writing them on my own. And that's kind of how they started. And so by the time my friend asked me for this completed project, I already had written many of the pieces already. So if anything, this project was more just the effort of compiling the books rather than me having written them after he came up to me with the project. I will say though, they already were bird themed before the project.
Oh, I love that.
I wrote these. So the of the two books that I published, the upper intermediate book For the Birds, I wrote that actually way back in college sophomore year. That was just because I just liked birds and I wanted to write a piano suite about birds for a late intermediate level. And then as I was also doing that while I was teaching, I was also writing these Little Birds pieces. So these were already happening for years, basically. And then, of course, once we decided to make it an actual formal project, we have added a lot more other things the illustrations were now part of it, the little fun facts, the little compositional exercises or experiments for the kids. All of that has been an ongoing process since then. So the idea originally was just my students need pieces that I can't find. I guess I'll just write some for them.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, yeah, for sure, because there's only so much that method books offer, and although they're pretty robust in their teachings, there are just some things that us as all students are so different, and so some of them might want a certain sound or need certain help on a particular thing. So us as piano teachers, I am myself, you have to come in and kind of supplement that. So I was just curious, so you probably taught with the standard piano method books, Piano Adventures and stuff?
When I first started, I was with Yamaha School.
Okay.
So they have a pretty different approach because they start everyone off in group lessons for the first, I want to say 3 years. The group lessons are very heavily, group lessons only for the first 2 or 3 years. And then for a while, then it becomes group lesson plus private lesson. So 2 lessons per week. And then that eventually becomes just private lesson when the students kind of quote unquote graduate group lessons. Group lessons are sort of like the Suzuki method in that they're very ear training based. There's a lot of singing in fixed do solfege that happens in every lesson. And as a result, a lot of the students develop perfect pitch. So I always liked that about that school, that it really trained my ear. Of course, every school of thought has its pros and cons as far as pedagogy goes. So for example, on that side, I would say that there was less of an emphasis on technique when playing the piano. So I wasn't shredding until much later. And actually pretty much not until I switched teachers and switched out of the school to just a private teacher who just worked on that stuff with me. This was probably early middle school. As far as what I teach, I do a pretty heavy variety. I don't like to just use one method book. I find Piano Adventures to be on the faster side as far as progression goes. So it can sometimes be tricky, especially on the primer and the level 1 stages, to work with students on those books sometimes, especially if it seems like a student really needs repetition on certain ideas. It depends on the age of the student. So sometimes I use, I think it's Sebastian, teaching No, teaching little fingers to play. Sorry, teaching little fingers to play. It's John Thompson.
Cool.
Teaching little fingers to play. So that's for like my like much younger students, and then for a little bit older, I will most often use Helen Marley's Succeeding at the Piano.
Got it.
It's probably my most common ones.
Okay, that's awesome. So I'm curious, like, so you've used these books and then you wrote your own book. So like, how were you, and I think you might have made a video on this, but like, how do you balance writing like easy, pure beginner music, but like make it fun and creative for the students? Like, how do you approach that?
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
It really is. And I think like, I can't say that I write these pieces very similarly. Sometimes it really just feels like it dawned upon me. Sometimes it's just like, oh yeah, like this makes so much sense and this sounds so good. And like one of the ones from the little birds, the swallow, that one pretty much was just like, I thought of the whole thing in a second. And then some other ones I have to be like very methodical and procedural, thinking like I want to explore a certain concept. I have to work under the constraints of hand size and finger position changes. So what can I do with that? And then I come up with something. So for example, I would say that the Blackbird was a lot more on that side, I believe. I had to get a little more creative because I didn't want, that one is the one that starts off, that has like a spooky right hand and then the left hand melody. And then on the second half, it's a little bit more of like both hands are a little active with some staccato. So that one I had to like really try a bunch of different things and then find the best one for the second half.
Yeah.
It really, really depends. It's so hard. And I don't think it's a thing that actually comes to me very intuitively, but I end up just like getting so caught up in it that I just end up putting a lot of time into it most of the time. And then sometimes it just comes to me.
It's hard because you have to balance, like there's only certain constraints that the beginners have, but like still trying to make those constraints fun by like, I like the idea of the birds, like that you just so happen to have that and you added the facts and like it kind of goes with the birds too, which I think is cool. What kind of reception have you gotten from your students? Like, do they enjoy having something a little different?
I think my students are biased because they're like, oh my God, my teacher wrote this. And so I'm like always going to be like met positively with students. I've never not, I will say, but I think it's largely because of the bias. And luckily, yeah, like for any students that I've written these pieces for, like, it's not like, I mean, very few students are just like, I absolutely love piano lessons, but they are also like, actually one of my students put it very, I think of what I would say is a pretty good summary of how most students, I think in general, would probably be feeling is like, I think like in most reasonable best cases, it's like, I don't like that I have to go to lessons, but I like lessons okay. I like my teacher, and I like playing pieces I like. I think he listed those 4 things. I think that's like a pretty accurate summary of like general mentality of the students. So like for kids like that, if I write them a piece, because I'm writing it also so that they like it, like they're going to like it. So it's been met very well. Right now, ironically, I don't have any students of that beginner level for the little birds. I've been getting new students the last, I want to say 2 years, but they either all grew out of it or they were just started out a little bit past that. So I actually haven't assigned, not since I published it, I haven't assigned any of those pieces to anyone.
Ooh.
But of course I've assigned those pieces as I wrote them to many students in the past.
I see. I'll start assigning them. I'll write you and be like, okay, here's the most popular one.
Yeah. I've been hearing a lot of feedback from friends who've been assigning it to their students, for sure.
I think it's interesting what you said, like your student, where he was like, well, I like my teacher, you know, and I like playing things that I enjoy. I think it's important, like outside of like doing like the methodical things of like learning the pedagogy, but just truly enjoying like sharing your music and a story and enjoying it for yourself too. So I like that your book engages in that. I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of, I value that a lot in the lessons I teach as well.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I will see you online. Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, so that was our episode. Thank you so much for joining today. It was so cool learning to hear from his experiences. And until then, keep on creating.